Okay, thank you all so much for coming. This is such an amazing turnout. We're gonna get started. So I'm gonna just go through a few housekeeping things, then I'm gonna give like a brief introduction to the event tonight to talk a little bit about what archiving in the age of impermanence means. And then I'll introduce our speakers and then we'll get started. So the first thing is we're encouraging masks. Masks are pretty much all here, but if you want one, there's some in the very back of the room. We also just want to mention that tonight's event is being recorded, as you can see. It's not being live streamed, but it is being recorded to be shared online at a later date for folks who couldn't be here. I want to begin by giving a really big thank you to Sabina Griffin. She's not here, but she was enormously helpful in getting tonight's event put together. This panel has been generously supported by the Center for Public Humanities and by the American Studies Department here at Brown, so a huge thank you to them for making it possible. So the schedule basically is that each of our panelists will speak for about 20 minutes. So we'll have like an hour presentation, and then we'll have 10 or so minutes for Q&A, and then we have a reception. So we hope you'll stay with us for that. There's food and wine that will be set up in that room. We're also going to open up the garden if you'd like to eat and drink outdoors, if that's more comfortable. So we hope you'll stay for that. Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit of background information. My name is Kristen Yema. I'm a PhD candidate in the American Studies Department, and I'm also a fellow here at the center. Tonight's event was co-organized by myself and by Fletcher Bach, who's running tech tonight. Fletcher is part-time faculty at RISD in the Department of Computation, Technology, and Culture, and in the Department of Digital Media. The inspiration for tonight's event was a series of conversations that Fletcher and I have had over the past few years about the overlaps and divergences in our work. I am an archivist by training, and Fletcher is an artist by training. Over the course of many conversations about our respective work, we started to realize that we were in fact interested in many of the same sorts of questions. The more we talked, the more we felt like there was so much to be gained from putting the fields of art and archives into conversation with one another. And so a new set of questions arose. How might the field of archiving influence artistic practice, and how might artists help us to reimagine what recording or what record keeping and documentation can look like? How might engaging with questions about power and representation through an archival lens inspire new lines of artistic inquiry? How might artists help archivists to think more creatively, more dynamically, and more capaciously about what constitutes record keeping? Is a 3D scan of a hug and its resultant sculpture, to reference a piece made by Rosalie Yu that I hope we'll see tonight, an archival document? If so, how might work like this help archivists to reimagine what archival practice can look like, not only in content, but in form? Additionally, how might artists help us to complicate archival concepts like author and subject? If we radically expand the definition of a record to include new forms, both material and immaterial, how might that help us to reimagine the shape and contours of archives themselves? These questions are further complicated by our present digital moment. Digital media have afforded artists and archivists the ability to document and record at previously unimaginable levels. Yet despite its purportedly infinite storage capacity, the virtual world is also a precarious site for storage and documentation, one where users face the paradox of permanence and impermanence simultaneously. We are excited to think through these challenging questions with our panelists tonight. Archives have too often been characterized by asymmetrical power relations and epistemic violence, but they don't have to be. We can take inspiration from artistic interventions and from radically innovative archival endeavors to explore the ways that redefining the very concept of archival records might yield new sets of archival relations predicated upon principles of collectivity, equity, and care. So I'm going to introduce our three panelists who we're so thankful to have here. Rosalie Yu is a Taipei-born artist and researcher. Her practice uses data as a working material that she sculpts and transforms into visualizations, resin sculptures, domestic installations, and printed material. She often engages groups in workshops and social spaces in which participants explore methods of quantifying and archiving. The core of her practice concerns how to question power by documenting our interactions with technologies and each other. Rosalie is a current member at New Museum's New Inc. in collaboration with Rhizome. Her work has been supported by the Brown Institute for Media Innovation at Columbia Journalism, ACCAD at Ohio State University, and EdLab at Teachers College, Columbia University. Paul Soulellis is an artist and educator based in Providence, Rhode Island. His practice includes teaching, writing, and experimental publishing with a focus on queer methodologies and network culture. He is founder and director of Queer Archive Work, a nonprofit residency, library, and publishing studio, and department head and associate professor of graphic design at the Rhode Island School of Design. Paul writes and speaks about art, design, and experimental publishing internationally, was a design insight speaker at the Walker Art Center in 2018, and was a featured speaker at the I.O. Festival in 2019. Paul is also the founder of Library of the Printed Web, a physical archive devoted to web-to-print artists' books, zines, and printout matter, now housed at the Museum of Modern Art Library in New York City. Regina Longo is an audiovisual archivist, historian, researcher, producer, and film programmer. She manages the Modern Culture and Media Film and Video Archives and teaches in the Department of Modern Culture and Media at Brown University. She began her archival career at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, a memorial museum in Washington, D.C., where she managed the preservation of the Claude Lanzmann Shoah Outtakes collection. She has also produced feature film restorations for the Albanian National Film Archives. She has served as director of the board of the Association of Moving Image Archivists and as associate editor of Film Quarterly. Her scholarship has been published in anthologies and journals including The Velvet Light Trap, the Journal of the Moving Image, and Film Quarterly. She currently serves on the editorial board. Oops. I've lost the last page. Which is sort of the editorial board. I'm so sorry. Please join me in giving a really warm welcome to all three of our panelists.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you, Fletcher, for bringing me here, two of my favorite people. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. I'm very honored to be here and share my project with you today, along with Paul and Regina. And like Christian's introduction, my name is Rosalie. I am an artist and researcher from Taiwan and working in New York, so thank you for bringing me here. I will describe I have a research-based practice, and in my work, I manipulate different tools to give form to impossible feelings and expressions that don't fit neatly into the conventional Western standard or cannot be seen in standard resolutions. To do so, I often engage groups in which we explore slow rituals of archiving and quantifying. I use data we gather as working material, and I translate them into installations, into visualizations, into sculptures and printed materials. And today I will share 3 projects. The first one is called Knowing Together. It's a grant-funded workshop with 40 strangers measuring the nuance of physical intimacy by creating sculptures of their experience. So a little bit about myself as someone who's coming from a very different culture and personal norm. I constantly need to navigate in situations where I feel very ambivalent. And so I recreated this situation for people to experience and capture their experience, capture their interactions. So to explain, imagine you're in the workshop. We first learn how to give and receive attention from the complete stranger through eye contact and prolonged embrace. And the second part of the workshop, we stand in a circle, a pair of strangers stand in the middle, and other participants surrounds the pair, take turns snapping a photograph and pass around the camera. And here is all the photographs that's taken by different participants from different angles. I then digitally collage the images into a surface using a technique called photogrammetry. You can think about it as a liminal medium between photography and sculpture. And the length of each capture is really determined by the capturing process. Sometimes it's 10 minutes. So what you see in here, each dot is where the photograph was taken and an animation showing how the camera traveled. And a lot of things could happen in 10 minutes. And here you see in this embrace let go in the middle. So you see that there's no photographs on the right side from the data portrait on the left, and there is an opening in the model on the right side. And I was very interested in to see how human errors or missing photo data could actually shed more light into the limits of physical and emotional boundaries. So a lot of thoughts was put into thinking about how to preserve this process. And in the end, I was able to suspend the broken embrace and risen. And after the workshop, I also asked the participant to reflect on the process and ask them to, and a lot of them talk about physical and emotional fatigue during the process. So this project for me is, I'm treating this spatial measurement tool as a way to think about how to decenter the solitary observer, solitary photographer, and seeing the stitching of multiple perspectives as a framework for understanding something together or forming knowledge together. So the second project that I wanted to share is called Photographic Knitting Club. It's a pandemic project I did in Taiwan during lockdown. It's very much a continuation of the previous projects. And the difference is I bring this shared experience to people's homes. The name was inspired by knitting circles or stitch and pitch, which is basically a group of women come together and make something with hand. But it's really not about the thing that they make, but it's about people come together, gossip about things, and check in on each other. It was also during this time that me and my friends would try to watch movie together on Zoom each week, and so I was very inspired by this community function of Knitting Club. And the first part of the project is, like last project, is the workshop. In the workshop, we explore ways to reframe spatial measurement tools that I used in the previous project that's rooted in science and math and as a tangible craft, and combine that with our physical understanding of the space that have changed a lot during the pandemic. So in the next example, I will show in this meeting, Andrew, the participants, act out his daily routine by walking around and taking photographs. I'll play a quick video. No, it's playing.
So every morning, the first thing I see is this chair. My cat likes to sit there because he can catch a sunbeam. There's a short little hallway that connects my bathroom and my bedroom and ends in the living room. One wall of my living room is sort of devoted to like a cat station, so he has like his food, his water. Right next to the kitchen, there's a wall with like sort of a little picture window, but right past that picture window is a dining room table, which I don't eat at because I sort of turned it into a home office. The lighting is better for Zoom meetings. Due to the pandemic, my job has been cut a little bit. I notice as I'm walking around doing this recording that I have a good collection of strange things, which, when you're in the same place every day, they fade into the background. Got it?
And so the same, I turn this walk into a data portrait. As you can see, the triangle is his bedroom where he started, and then the black box is the laptop where he's communicating to us, and the outer shape is the contour of the room that's calculated by the software. And next, I will show you another example of Lauren in another meeting recording herself walking from living room to patio to take a break. You can see, does it play?
They'll probably come out here. To probably do phone calls or sit and do some work outside. I honestly come and sit on the ground right here. It's the only shady spot in the morning. Oh my gosh, there's a deer over there right now. Oh my gosh, there's 2 deer. They're running. And I would sit right here. Chill out against the fence. And I would come back up. At this point, I'd probably leave or do something, but in quarantine, I'd probably want to do a non-work related thing.
In this next video, it's in this another workshop that asks everyone to hand draw their space.
Imagine this rectangle is a bird's eye view of your laptop. And without looking away, use your computer as an anchor. I want us to draw the contour or the shape of your room.
Mine's only so big because I'm outside. I'm not trying to take over the land.
It's okay.
Drawing is something that's embodied and tap into our intuition. So I was trying to see what insight we can bring when putting a drawing that's in their data portraits. So here is what people produce. On the right side is what people draw. On the left side is their space calculated by the measurement tool. So after the workshop, I process, anonymize, and reappropriate the data that the participants choose to contribute. And my guiding principle is to not put their space on display, but to use the 3D reconstruction as an intimate material for handicraft. So first I study their space as an object in my hand. I see them from the bird's eye view, I see them from underneath the carpet and peeking through the window, and I hand trace over them. So what you can see here are pillows, towels, carpets, and comforters that I found from people's spaces. And these are the results of a workshop I did for MFA students at Berkeley back in October, which turned into the exhibition. Tracing allowed me to find common objects from different spaces, such as floorboards and books, and I developed my own classification system. And I cut out the floors and books from different homes and wove them together into a paper tapestry. And this is almost like a archaeological process. I'm taking out evidence of life from different spaces. Here you see ephemeral imprints on bed sheets and seating pads were preserved. They're trying to call attention to the tactility of digitizing tools. They're trying to question the quality, such as remoteness and data extraction in service of real estate or surveillance that's usually used with 3D scanning. And here I emphasize details from different spaces and manipulate them into, I call it the monument of home during confinement, during the COVID, we all have to turn on our camera and give away our data just to interact with each other. But this project, what I'm trying to explore is ways we can reclaim some power and call attention to the labor and craft that's usually feminized and dismissed in domestic spaces. In the remaining of talk, I want to share a new project I'm developing. It's really my current fascination, which is about coin-operated kitty rights. I study them as a way to understand memory, family history, class, and post-colonial artifacts. So my grandfather in Taiwan picked up this labor-intensive work of repairing, painting, and repainting and transporting these machines. and collecting the coins for a living. For those of you who don't know what kitty ride is basically these machines that you see on the street. You put in a coin and start going back and forth and singing songs. I kind of like to see it as like Mary doesn't go around just going back and forth. The machine that he kept alive also outlived him. And looking at them, I have come to ask if there's something more going on with his rides. Maybe it's the creepy makeup by amateur craftsmen like my grandpa that makes them look absurd or even kind of cursed. And curse is something that's hard to pinpoint. It doesn't fit neatly into one category. It's cute, it's monstrous, and it's grotesque. And I'm trying to unpack this feeling of an object being physically and spiritually cursed. So I've been collecting information about these machines, including reading old trade journals and patents. These are from billboards from the 50s. And patents that, the first ever patent that was filed for Happy Horse in the 30s. I was also trying to find digital traces of changes that's usually invisible. Street View allowed me to go into the past, and I was trying to see if I can find rides that's put out by my grandfather in Taiwan. I couldn't, but I was able to see transitions in front of this Brooklyn drugstore, from motorcycle to horse to a kangaroo to a donkey to a pony. You can see it's like on the right side. And through Street View, I was also able to chase down a repair shop in Gowanus, Brooklyn. During my interview with the owner was trying to sell his business to me and get into metaverse and crypto. He has been in business since the 80s, so he managed all of the rides in 5 boroughs in New York, or most of the rides. And he told me Pac-Man go out of fashion, but all the kids from all the decades will want to ride a horse. But the pandemic has made him auction a lot of his rides. And when I was at his workshop, I was very haunted by how much my childhood laundry room resembled his workshop, just piles of faded machine waiting for a second life and the smell of the paint. I also conducted oral history with my family, who seldom talk about their past. Here is a 1-minute video of the interview.
马子代表女朋友啊，所以就说阿公，哇，马子真多哎，买了就贼。说起来蛮有趣的哦，就阿公有点花心。
阿公有那个喷油漆的设备啊，那喷的时候戴口罩，那搞不好碰后来有那个疾病，搞不好会不会喷油漆也有关系，会不会？
说爸爸真伟大，为国举大章。
比方说百浪滔滔我不怕，或者什么那些卡通歌曲多了。
小甜甜，小甜甜，
有一个女孩叫甜甜，从小生长在孤儿院。
对。
Yeah, so I actually found out about my grandpa actually having a lot of other girlfriends other than my grandma through doing the interview, and it's just interesting because my family was very, they were very surprised that anyone would actually wanted to know about their history, because no one has ever done that or asked them before. And I spent some time in Taiwan due to visa restrictions in the past a year and a half. So I reflected a lot on my childhood in Taiwan. Taiwan it's occupied by both the East and the West in the past, and is still threatened by powerful neighbors till this date. And looking at these rides, it feels to me that the post-colonial characteristics are manifested in their candy colors, and their creepy smiles, and just layers of poisonous shining glaze. This project would be sculpture objects and horror documentary film informed by studies of these machines and what curse could mean, feel, or look like. What you're seeing here, these are curse rides from Taiwan that I made with clay, and I made rubber molds and cast them with resin and fiberglass. Fiberglass is a common and toxic material used for kiddie rides to maintain the structure integrity without withstand the weight. I also some ones that I made. I also cast and painted many cursed eyes. And here is an uncanny ride that I generated using machine learning, referencing rides from my memory from the street of New York, and I augmented on the street. So this project is really a journey down into a rabbit hole. So although my grandfather has already passed away, linking my ritual of data gathering with his ritual maintenance is really my effort to stay with the mystery of his labor, of these obsolete machines and post-colonial artifacts, which are at the intersection between fantasy and nightmare, trash we ignore and artifacts we value, and just the uncertain status of Taiwan. I think that's my presentation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kristen and Fletcher, for organizing this. I'm getting over a bit of a cold. It was not COVID, but I did have a cold. Can everyone hear me okay? So thank you so much for organizing this and for putting us together. It's really exciting to be on a panel with two artists whose work that I know, and just listening to Rosalie's presentation and thinking about the sort of immediacy and contingency of the everyday that comes into the work of an artist who's also working with memory, and some senses in an impermanence, but also the hidden labor that Rosalie is revealing in many, many ways, so in all of her projects. So it's great to be able to kind of sit between two artists and talk a little bit about the work of an archivist who's often taking care of collections of others, and then I'm going to shift from taking care of collections of others to talking about working with students and working with media makers and creators to think about how we can mobilize archives in different ways. A little bit about my own work first, so a bit of a preamble before I jump into the slides. For over 20 years, I've worked to recuperate audiovisual archives, so that's primarily archives of moving images, whether they are analog or digital, celluloid film, standard definition video, or again, various formats of what we saw in Rosalie's presentation today as well. This also includes preservation of documentary and feature films that are produced by commercial and government entities, and preservation of amateur and non-commercial media as well. Conducting this work requires deep investigations into the provenance of materials and the context of their production. In my professional role as a restorationist and preservationist, which requires both technical skills and creativity, I remain cognizant that I am a caretaker of work and materials that are the physical and intellectual property of another group, groups, or individuals. I'm constantly considering faithfulness to original works, even as I question the intent of some of these original works. Then in my role as a teacher or guide for the next generation of audiovisual archivists, curators, and media makers, I challenge students to push further to consider what more traditional forms of fidelity have produced in media preservation and restoration, and how they might disrupt these original works of art that are being preserved to bring new relevance to other works, and also to open up other lines of thought and other types of practice. And I see that's what Rosalie and Paul are doing that already, right? Opening other lines of thought and other types of practice. In the case of audiovisual media, many types of cinema and media, as I tend to deal with more traditional forms of cinema and media, imbricate forms of correction and repair with reenactment and historical revisionism. Correction or repair does not always lead to a fuller picture. While these acts can enhance existing histories and acknowledge persistent erasures, they can also be a means of further redaction and further erasure. If we're actively seeking to expand and complicate narratives, which I believe in this present moment, most people that I engage with, we're really trying to expand and complicate what has existed up until this point. We need to really think about formulating an approach that combines careful reflection and repair of audiovisual records still used to defend, distort, uplift, challenge, and revise histories. I believe that there's beauty, creativity, and risk involved in each of these practices. Once archives and new works created from these earlier works circulate among new publics, further reckonings take place, new imaginaries emerge, and the necessity for further repair and reimagination still persists. So again, in this talk, I'm going to try to parse out some case studies where I have worked as preservationist, project manager, and restorationist, and then shift a bit to talking about some of the courses I've developed here at Brown that I'm teaching for undergrads and grads at Brown and RISD to really think through this kind of transition from analog to digital technologies, notions and myths about access that most of us have embraced, even more so in the COVID era. There's a lot that has been made more available to us, but there's a lot that still maintains its physical materiality, and in order to access that material, how can we open and break down walls and really make that access more equitable? So I believe in this sense in sharing not only the shining successes of archival work, but also the false starts, the murky in-betweens, and the utter failures. If there's one thing that working with mechanical and analog objects can immediately deliver us, it's the ability to see, and most importantly, to touch and feel the rips and tears in machine-generated processes. This is, of course, possible with many digital technologies, but most of us don't feel compelled to take apart a computer or a server or really learn code and kind of dig deeply into algorithms, right? We can do this a little bit more easily with a film projector, with a can of film that we open up, even with a video cassette that is magnetic media that is the carrier, right? We can't pull that string out of the plastic case and actually see what we will see when we put that in a player. But we have something we can touch and feel. And in the way that I engage with students who are just starting to think through all these forms of materiality, I really encourage students to get their hands on things, get messy, get dirty, and think about the confidence that you build by working with your body, embodying the space, and working with material objects will then give you problem-solving skills that can be channeled into solving the more complex digital problems that we are facing as archivists who really want to encourage access. So I'm going to go through a few different case studies of projects that I've worked on in the past that kind of show how we're moving through these spaces as audiovisual archivists. In 2020, I wrote in this anthology, The Construction of Testimony, that focuses on the Shoah outtakes, just how much time I had spent at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. as the project manager, preserving and restoring film to film and film to digital over 200 hours of outtakes from Claude Lanzmann's film Shoah. That is an 8.5-hour film that originally premiered in 1985. I started this project in 1999. The collection came into the museum in 1996. It arrived in box after box after box under bed archives. Some things came from warehouses in Paris. Some things came from underneath Lanzmann's bed or his editor's bed. A lot of material came into our possession willy-nilly. So when I began in earnest to make sense of all these materials, what astonished me the most was just how much ephemeral information the collection held. There have been very few finished films that clock in at 8.5 hours, documentary or feature films. So understanding that that was a final cut of this film, we know that many, many more hours were shot. So a viewer can look at these images and at the audio recordings and kind of get some sort of experience and understanding of what was at play, but they're not really sufficient to understand the process of what goes into making a film of this magnitude, and also to understand the myths that were created during the time in which Lanzmann was working on this film. He starts in the 1970s, getting a lot of funding from the State of Israel. He doesn't really mention that publicly. It's sort of something that is pushed to the side because he doesn't want to make this that particular type of political project, though he does have a strong rhetorical and ideological project that he has engaged in trying to understand this eternal why of how something like the Holocaust could happen in Europe. And In doing this, he continues to perpetuate a myth of what his project was and the importance that it has for histories of the Shoah. And I also believe that his myth has actually done a disservice to the work that he actually did. It became bigger than the individual, and in a sense, the work behind the scenes that we were doing as archivists was dismantling this master's narrative and showing the constructedness and the seams that go into making any kind of film. So here I'm going to show you basically all 200 hours of the outtakes are now digitized, so film to film and film to digital. I left the museum in 2005. We had started the digitization process, but nothing went online until 2014. So here we're going to see a behind the scenes clip of part of the mega myth that Landsman himself spoke about so often. Let's see if we can get, okay. We like to run everything here since these are the outs and the trims. You're going to see all that stuff, those murky in-betweens that you never see in a finished piece. Here's Landsman behind the scenes preparing for the interviews that he's going to conduct with a hidden camera. There were several members of the Einsatzgruppen who were the German perpetrators who he had approached and wanted to interview on camera. They had consistently refused to be interviewed on camera. So this is in the late 70s. So he constructs with his tech crew, we'll see his cameraman coming in now. They construct a kind of hidden camera that's going to be strapped to his body. We're going to see a little bit of that in just a second. And they basically figure out a way to get this done, right? In the finished film, you do see instances where they're cutting back and forth between the grainy, well, not even grainy because it's video. So the several lines of black and white video that we see on a small monitor as he's interviewing these individuals in their homes, unbeknownst to them, they are being recorded. So we see this whole contraption being strapped on him here. For the longest time, Landsman didn't talk about any of this either because he had been arrested for actually doing this kind of surreptitious interviewing during the making of Shoah. But as one gets further and further from a point of creation for a historical event or a work of art, the myth continues to develop. And Landsman, again, working to create his own myth, was finally at a point where he was going to tell this whole story about what they had done to really outsmart everyone. Again, some of it was, it was complicated, but some of it were just sort of the exigencies of that moment, right? As I was mentioning with Rosalie's work, the immediacies and contingencies of the everyday. Oh my God, we want to get this. How are we going to do it? And then that becomes sort of a larger than life story. So now, as of 2014, anyone can go online who can gain access to this website, if you have that access, and you can view all the 200 hours of outtakes. You can look at the transcripts, you can look at taxicab receipts, you can see footage that was never meant to have been recorded, where even Landsman didn't realize that they were still running the film when he was talking to interview subjects or to others off camera. And you can piece together this story in a different way and understand just how many things he left out of the 8.5-hour film because he had a particular agenda. And for so long, again, it wasn't until his death in 2018 that much stronger access has, let's see, we're going back. I want to get out of this and go back to, that much more access has been, and I want to, has been made possible as a result of the fact that he is no longer there kind of maintaining this control over that story. But behind the scenes, we were constantly at work pulling things apart and saying, okay, how much of this can we get out there? How much of this can we show? How much can be in circulation so that more people can interpret this for history, for creative purposes? You know, we don't want to kind of determine how that is going to be used, and so you want to make as much of that possible available as possible. So these aberrations that we saw in the collections turned out to be not so much aberrations. If we compared what his narrative, what Landsman, the filmmaker's narrative was, to what we were actually seeing in the collection, there were a lot more of these sort of messy and murky in-betweens. And you can see those at any time if you head to the Holocaust Museum's website, and you could play all 200 hours. I would not recommend that. It's a lot. The other thing that he also always argued against is that he never did research in other archival film collections, and this was only about recording testimony to draw attention to the constructiveness of testimony and the subjectivity of testimony. But in fact, in the collection, there are several reels of archival material that come from liberation of the camps, et cetera. So he was working with this material as well. In the end, it just didn't make it into his final picture. So, I mean, sometimes we also fall into situations without knowing where they're going to lead us. And this is what happened with the work I started with the Albanian Cinema Project that I ran. I founded it in 2012 and co-directed that until 2018. And I still remain connected to the National Film Archives in Albania, and I'm working with them in sort of a consultant and just a kind of friendly capacity to help them continue to get their film and video collections into circulation and to continue to advocate with their government to continue to preserve these materials. Before 2011, when I first arrived in Albania, I'd never seen an Albanian feature film. But there was a part of me that's always intrigued by the unknown and always up for some kind of archival challenge. The challenges in Albania were many. Albania is still a young democracy. Their 45-year dictatorship ended in 1990, and the films created under the dictatorship are considered stridently propagandistic. Unlike some of their Western Balkan neighbors, the Albanian government and its people have not yet publicly reconciled with the traumas perpetrated by their repressive state regime. As a result, the Ministry of Culture chose benign neglect of the country's decades-long history of feature and documentary film production, produced mostly under the state-sponsored studio system. I gotta get rid of Landsman, he's in there still talking. Let me go back, and then I think I have to go back here, and then now I'm gonna have two of them. Cut that out. Do I have another one? Yes. Okay, great. Okay, now here, I'll go forward. Benign neglect was the order of the day for the Kino Studio films for their documentary and feature film productions. But outright destruction and burying of evidence remains the order of the day for the government film and photo collections that documented forced labor camps and other atrocities of the Hoxha-era dictatorship. So one of the first skills that I put to use in Albania was basically something that I had learned during my time at the Holocaust Museum. And it was more about diplomacy and empathy and less about the technical expertise. I mean, I knew I had that part, but the other part is really what makes the difference. Again, when materials are being siloed off because of benign neglect or because of intentions of state actors, and not only state actors, what can we do to kind of open up these conversations and understand how responses to trauma shape both national and individual character? As I mentioned in the introduction, as a professional archivist, my goal is to preserve as much as possible so that these reckonings can take place. And these reckonings take their own time, so certain conversations cannot be forced, no matter how much we think as experts about the physical materials that we are working with, that we know what should be done and that we know that time is running out, right? There's this kind of constant narrative that persists, and we see it in all, we have to save it before it's too late. We've got to digitize it before it's too late. I think most of the people in this room, I recognize several faces, and then with my two fellow panelists are working with collections in various states of repair or decay or disrepair, and so we understand that material objects do transform. They may degrade, they may actually remain quite stable, but we have more time than we think, and that's an important thing to remember as well. The race to just save and preserve and digitize and throw out there also means less time to really think it through and to really make sense of the materials that we're looking at. So, and this is again where some of that race to preserve is fantastic, because then it puts things into the hands of students, into the hands of artists, into the hands of scholars who can take that time. So that's the kind of double-edged sword and the crossroads that's in like the title of my talk. How can we make sure that we have that material so that these happenstances sometimes, sometimes it's a planned search for a particular kind of material. Sometimes it's just how we come to things and the way that we move through our worlds and different communities as well. So again, thinking about this physical materials, archivists usually arrive to collections as outsiders, and we first must foster trust in order to foster knowledge exchange and open access. So there are different ways in which we have to understand and appreciate the communities that we work with. And I think that's extremely important, and I think that's something that, Kristen, you can probably talk about this as well, because so many archivists now are really thinking more clearly in these ways. It's not just about taking whatever has landed on your desk from some kind of hierarchical structure. It's about thinking through what communities do these serve, how do we invite people into these spaces, make these spaces welcoming, and have the conversations that need to be had. So while the restorations that I did with the Albanian Cinema Project are more or less faithful restorations, and again, I'm always kind of wondering, how do we question this faithfulness to an original, and what does that original mean in a medium that is one of mechanical reproduction? And again, so we played with sound and image quality, but one important intervention we were able to make with the Albanian Cinema Project was the restoration of actors and crew members' names to the credits of the films. Several of the names of crew members and actors had been erased in the original release versions in Albania because these individuals had fallen out of favor with the regime. So in being able to reinstate those names, there are small and very subtle ways, you would have to watch the entire credits for the film, to really understand these subtle interventions that we're able to make at that particular site. At this time, unfortunately, the paper records in which we found these documentations of whose names were redacted and who was removed have not yet been scanned. So these materials are sitting in archives in Albania, but the only way to access them is by being there and speaking and getting to understand from the individuals at that archive what exists in those particular collections. And then one of the other big things we did is really try to move these films into global circulation. So this was a national film industry that had had limited circulation because of the ways in which the country had been closed off. So circulation a little bit back and forth between France and Italy and into some other festivals. So in this next step that we took, kind of pushing things forward and getting things out for people to talk about, we looked at the BFI and we streamed some stuff through television in the UK and also on Turner Classic Movies. And this, I'm going to put up the volume in just a second, but this is an example of the promo for one of the films that we restored that then screened in 2020 on Turner Classic Movies.
Is outside having fun with their friends.
That rather simplifies the complicated histories.
Or playing some boys, mastering the real life art of spying, fighting fascists in the name of fun. Capturing these real actions is what director Jean-Philippe Keiko specializes in with her children's films. One of the founding members of the New Albania Film Studio, Keiko was her country's first female film director. At a time when their society was closed off from the rest of the world and creative expression was restricted. This didn't deter Jean-Philippe, however, from bringing films like Tonka and His Friends to the big screen, where we root for the kids to get payback after their beloved soccer field is taken over by Nazis. Keiko's ability to convey children's perspectives was due in part to the personal relationship she formed with her troupe of young non-professional actors. Aunt Shauna, as she was called by the children, is remembered for her warmth and great kindness, as well as...
So I'm gonna stop that there, because it perpetuates a myth, right? I don't know if you noticed in the background, though, they are using kind of scans of the script and the continuity editing script for the film. They're using still photos. So even in this piece that is kind of perpetuating a particular kind of narrative about this moment in Albanian cinema, and packaging it for an American audience during Women's History Month to show, 30 days of films about women that made by women. There are still ways in which this PR, branding, and packaging aside, when someone finally sits down and watches that film for a few hours and then sort of thinks about that and lets that sit with them and potentially goes and seeks out more information in the end credits, you can see the links for the Albanian Cinema Project and can kind of dig more deeply into the work that we have done, or start a conversation in their community, or realize that they may know somebody who is originally from the Western Balkans and maybe even Albania in particular, and kind of open things up in a different way. So it's a little bit hokey, but I always say never underestimate the ways in which people find entree to information and then can make sense of that and open up another circle and another culture and another kind of world. And the last case study that I wanted to mention is a project that I'm involved in now that is really currently happening now almost entirely online. The Cinemateca Brasileira had been, again, closed down due to funding issues with the government. And by now you're kind of seeing a consistent theme in my work that has been about recovery of repressed archives. This is, again, ongoing work in Brazil to ensure that the workers and the materials in the archives can be, so that the workers can get their jobs back, and that also, this is working on two levels, activism on a social, political, economic level, and also to ensure that there's continued access to over 100 years of Brazilian film and television. It's an ongoing project, and we can't really be certain what the next steps are. Because of 2 years of pushing on the government in, this is all in Portuguese, and I'm just gonna briefly, kind of mention what they're talking about. Because of 2 years during the height of COVID of an international group of archivists, primarily from Latin America, the group called Arturita, who have been pushing this issue to the forefront, really getting everything that they could get their hands on that had been digitized from the collections and putting that out in circulation for virtual panel presentations that were going on all over the world for small and large audiences, and really getting people to think about what might be lost if we don't find a way to convince the government to put a little bit more money into these collections to get the workers back in the archives and to have this work continue. Again, this is where you're playing again with these aesthetics and this nostalgia for something that might get lost, and nostalgia for a particular kind of gloss that signals that something is archival, but there's still a lot more at stake. And then thinking about mobilizing new digital platforms for activism and for curation. So again, this is a scenario in which this work is ongoing, and they are making strides. They're slow, and it's going to change with each different political change that happens. We're aware of that happening everywhere in the world, but the archivists are still continuing to kind of push forward with this. And again, this is thinking about the longue durée and the long haul, and what this will mean to enable this access and to continue to provide this access. So let's go on to the next slide. So then I'm just kind of jumping to some thoughts about teaching and how I've tried to kind of transfer the work that I've done as an archivist to future generations of students and the types of materials that one can access. So most of us today are using some form of archival materials and accessing collections online through a variety of different aggregated database, digital content providers, or web portals. Whether we're accessing these conduits as students, scholars, or artists, understanding just what is or isn't available, and especially what is going on behind the scenes, will help us to begin to understand the means by which this data is aggregated, parsed, refined, and finally made accessible to end users. These are the critical interrogations for any end user of curated content. And one thing that I really stress in the classes is that, again, there's an embodied form of this practice. So students, and I see some of my students from one of the last classes I taught who are here, who really got their hands on stuff and had to kind of wind through all of this material and make sense of that mechanical process, locating their own physical bodies first and understanding how they must interact with legacy mechanical objects in order to make more sense of more tangible and ephemeral qualities of multiple formats of moving images. I wanted to highlight two works that were done during the height of COVID, where we had to shift entirely online and students would only work with digital collections. And again, as I called out when I was moving in through the information on Brazil, that there's a lot of work I've done with archives of suffering. So this is an opportunity, particularly in the teaching, to think about situating, having each individual who comes in contact with archives think about the subject positions that they use to make sense of these archival collections, to read against the grain, against the persistent narrative of suffering, and to locate, experience, and create joy, even if a collection is not tagged or advertised as such. And Kristen, you were mentioning this, kind of these structures, hierarchical structures of power again, that we find ourselves within, particularly in archives. I'm really happy to say that I think one of the things for me has been working as an archivist and really focusing on the next generation of archivists and artists, that 80% of the students in my class are self-identify as queer or students of color, which is fantastic because the archival field has been lacking in representation. So this is a really important step to change the face of who is working in archives, and then that's going to change what has been sitting on those shelves forever, and then what actually is able to rise to the surface in those collections. So we won't have time to look at these, but one of the students, John, was working with a collection of home movies of a queer man, Hal O'Neill, from, I can show you a little bit of this, and then I need to exit the stage left for Paul. So I'll keep the volume down, but he was working with a collection, a man born in 1910, but he's looking at his life in San Francisco in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and then how that dovetails with Harvey Milk's election, and brings all of these things together in this really fantastic way, where he's saying, you know, here I am, a young queer man, a young queer Chinese American man, trying to make sense of my place in this world, trying to relate to my family, what it means to embody this queer self, and not to consider it as something that is going to make my life difficult, right? I think that's one of the most beautiful things to kind of think about what is happening now in this particular moment, where people are taking even these archives that have been considered archives of suffering or instances of repression and turning that on its head and doing something else with it. So that's what keeps me motivated to keep getting stuff out there so that people can work with it. And now I'm going to pass the torch to Paul, who's going to share a bunch of stuff that he's been working on.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me, Kristen and Fletcher. I'm using this as an opportunity, actually, to present my work, but to do it in kind of a new context that I haven't tried out before. So this is a brand new for me articulation of these ideas, so I would love feedback afterwards. I was struck by the title of this event tonight, Archiving in the Age of Impermanence, thinking about what that means to me. What is the age of impermanence? When did it begin? And what are its bounds? Queer culture is always impermanent, always at risk of being lost. Ours is a history of illegibility, invisibility, and erasure. As a gay man who lived during the 80s and 90s, COVID is not my first pandemic. During the AIDS crisis, we saw the US government neglect an entire generation, especially gay men, people of color, transgender people, people living in poverty, forgotten not just in death, but in their living struggles and actions that now barely register, barely legible in our written histories. In their erasure, we lose stories from our collective memory. Recently, I've been compelled to time travel, to go back into archives 30, 40, 50 years later, to find evidence of who and what was lost, the connective tissue between here and there. Maybe to find myself, even. And who did not survive? How do I navigate this? What do I find there? And how can we do better? So I'm looking here in 1970, and here in the late 80s, and here in the mid-90s. These are urgent artifacts showing the effort to be seen and heard while queer life was delegitimized, neglect was normalized, and stories of failure were erased from collective memory. Today, because of digitization and the important work of non-traditional archivists, often activists and artists who are themselves the survivors of crisis and trauma, we find evidence. Print collectives, trans newsletters, queer zines, ACT UP meeting minutes, bulletin board posts, party flyers, protest signs, and other materials that can help us reconnect and repair these incomplete histories. In them, we can see communities in action, alive in support and survival, using print and digital material as the connective tissue. These are ephemeral acts and public gestures during crisis that tell the story and spread the word, working across time, within and against erasure. Finding and learning about them is rewarding work. Sharing them is our responsibility. During the AIDS crisis, in some of the same places where the most suffering was happening, New York City, San Francisco, the early internet was blooming. New kinds of relations were forming on community bulletin board services between connected terminals, and later on in web browsers. The national context for all of this was unthinkable crisis, but we rarely think about these two together, the AIDS pandemic and the early internet. They seem to contradict each other in spirit and outcome, one a disaster, the other a dream. Within both, we can trace the tangled evolution of networks and radical alternatives. This was all before we knew how to preserve what we were making and what it might mean to save these cultures that were about to go missing for an unknown future, and why we would even need to do that. Before we knew the full extent of the loss, before we knew the debt that would be incurred. And so I go back to these early years of the network, to what's referred to as the digital dark age, to better understand what it felt like to search for others beyond limits, to yearn for connection while the floor was dropping away. All of that painful searching. The simultaneous loss and connection of networks falling apart while others are being built. Can we do this now? Can we hold these contradictions together in this same moment, here in this talk, in an attempt to expand what we know about network culture and why that matters to us today in our current crises? These new spaces and relations were not only online. We were building networks that transcend time and space, or so we thought, or so we hope now. Network culture, like this, in the early 80s, but also network culture like this in the early 90s. And this, currently. Decentralized forums like the early net, but also the telephone chain, DIY libraries and archives, public space interventions, video activism, record keeping, community centers, organizing on Zoom. This was and is the connective tissue. So this is a sketch of an expanded notion of network culture as it came into being before, during, and after the AIDS pandemic. This is an attempt to re-see that history with this fuller, more painful context in mind, and from this to learn and to imagine better futures. Queer theory came out of that moment, emerging from the necropolitics of the Reagan-Bush years and giving us a way to look beyond chaos and crisis towards queer kinship, solidarity networks, speculative imagining, away from heteronormativity. We got that language given to us by Jose Esteban Munoz and others. I'm looking at how entangled these forces were in that moment, these messy radical ideas about printing, publishing, networks, theory, collectivity, queerness, erasure, and futurity. I'm looking at the affordances and failures of archival practices in crisis conditions. That is, after all, our current condition. And so I'd like to speak now about what I'm calling non-cooperative archival practices. Non-cooperative because these are the gestures that emerge out of urgent times as acts of resistance. These are archival impulses that have nothing to do with the conventional archive or archival studies. These are the informal, independent, wild, failed archives, bad archives, that form lovingly and messily in basements, in closets, in storerooms, in parks, dead-end hand-coded web pages and YouTube playlists, unsearchable archives, improperly cared for, radically open and accessible collections that don't really protect what they keep. These were never even archives at all. They're acts of survival that help us stitch together and speculate in absence and conflict. These are the PDFs and badly scanned images and haunted listservs that give us permission to time travel, searching for lost ones. Evidence of ourselves, of them. Improper archives holding evidence of community organizing, artistic projects and activism, messy spaces of possibility and action. This is the work I've been doing for a while. I started almost 10 years ago with a project called Library of the Printed Web. It was a loosely curated publishing project and collection of artists' books and ephemera that eventually got acquired by MoMA Library and legitimized as valuable and worthy enough for history. But it began with a crude idea about how unstable, impermanent materials like a wooden crate, newsprint, and print-on-demand zines might tell us something else about network culture beyond the internet of our screens or parallel to it. Something about how artists were working with ordinary digital material after the iPhone, but before Trump, printing it out to look closely and to see what was being lost. What I learned is that printing is always political, and that printing the web changes the texture and charge of material, from impermanent to stable, from fast to slow, from visual to haptic. Printing the web signaled that all material is at risk of being lost, to never be seen again, even as it's held in your hands. The printed web of the 2010s was directly connected, spiritually at least, to this, the world's first public computerized bulletin board system created in 1973. It was called Community Memory. And the first terminal was located at Leopold's, a record shop in Berkeley. Eventually, there were terminals at other locations, all connected to a computer that ran the service at Resource One, a warehouse community in San Francisco. Early in 1974, someone printed the entire thing out, everything that had ever been posted to the service in the last year. It was a desperate attempt to create a material record working against disappearance. Now it exists as a hard-to-find set of PDFs that I did find and that I downloaded and searched through. They described the project like this: community memory is community mindfulness, not forgetfulness, in the root sense of the Greek word for truth, aletheia, having come out of hiddenness. It is communal retrieve of truth, communal disclosure, that which is left open by us to us. They said that in 1973, which is kind of remarkable. That retrieval, that recall, is something we can access right now in reading through their records. Here are some of those messages that they printed out. These are the very first posts to the internet ever by the general public. Recipes, conspiracy theories, manifestos, services needed, things for sale, roommates wanted, concert tickets, ride shares, drugs, poetry, personals. You name it. This was Reddit. This was Craigslist, almost 20 years before the web was invented. Community memory even contained the internet's very first troll, Dr. Benway, who appears all over these printouts. Every post was organized with keywords, which were chosen by the user, and this was the only way to organize or find anything. Through the language they used, we have this imperfect data set now of exactly what was on this network's mind 50 years ago. This is community memory. Is this one of the very first LGBTQIA posts on the internet ever? I don't know, it might be. Lavender Yu, to provide gay women and men and others exploring gay feelings the opportunity to share their knowledge. Here's another one, East Bay Gay. Another post gets to what they were doing with this project in clear language. Communication creates the conditions for community. The concept of the whole earth means access to one another, even more than it means access to tools. Individual freedom, competence, and control over our lives dies with us if our attempts to isolate ourselves from the American death culture and bureaucratic bullshit aren't matched by equal attempts to draw closer to those who share our feelings and to organize genuine alternatives. Keywords: whole earth, access, communication, community, radical, revolution, revolutionary, alternative, touch, love. March 1974. I never saw this printout when I was doing Library of the Printed Web. I wish I had. It would have changed the project, but that's okay. It's more powerful for me right now in the work I'm doing today, revisiting these signals from 50 years ago. What I see in them is the queer, non-cooperative impulse to save in the midst of the flow of culture as it's being lost. Queer because what's being gathered is often illegible to others, unworthy, not legitimate. Non-cooperative because the act of saving happens in spite of that dismissal. The bad archive forms itself in alternative spaces. Gathering ordinary scraps together in one place, working independently from the traditional archive and its history of violence and oppression, working against those practices by being outside them. Their keyword system was chaotic, but it's sort of worked. It's not a traditional index. It's not a controlled vocabulary. It's beautiful because it was created collectively by its users in real time. It may be connected to what Alex Yuhas calls queer archive activism, described as an activist relation to the archive that remains alert to its absences and that uses it to create new kinds of knowledge and new forms of collectivity. Queer archive activism insists that the archives serve not just as a repository for safeguarding objects, but also as a resource that comes out into the world to perform public interventions. 2 years ago, I started a nonprofit organization here in Providence called Queer Archive Work, with a mission to do just that, to build something that comes out into the world. Within it is a collection of materials centered on voices who are typically left out of archives. QAW is porous. It's a bad, leaky archive that allows for seepage, the exchange in and out of voices and ideas in all respects, in how we gather, in how we learn and grow, as a makerspace full of tools. More than tools, like we just saw in those posts, it's about access to one another. QAW exists because of our queer ancestors who helped make network culture in all of the ways I'm sketching out. And our vision now benefits from that history. It's about gathering ideas to connect and light up in the library. Shared space where we can be in conversation with those ancestors, with those who can't be with us, with each other, imagining new futures, with new ideas about queerness going out into the world through our large garage door open to the street. Our studio is a community memory terminal, a portal both inward and out. We can also get at this through our name, starting with the word queer. It both welcomes and limits for whom the space serves. At QAW, queerness is an expansive, limitless idea that resists definition. We use the word archive in our name non-cooperatively, refusing to impose classification on the materials and ideas there for now, and challenging what we even mean by that word. We don't even call it an archive. Actually, it's the library, and it changes every day as different people occupy the space. We take care of zines, books, and objects, but also impulses, exchanges, needs, and desires, because it sits within a working print production studio, serving a mostly local queer, trans, and BIPOC community. And we use the word work to acknowledge the ongoing labor in alternative publishing practices and how communal care, cooperation, and collective organizing in our space require hard work. As the burden of that work is often put upon the same people who are most oppressed by racism and heteropatriarchy, much of what we do is about prioritizing equity and the fair distribution of labor through collaboration and cooperativism. 40 people share our studio and its printing resources, residents, members, and organizers. And every 2 weeks, we're open to the public for browsing. The next one is 2 weeks from yesterday. For browsing, reading, resting, writing, discussion, connection. These different ways of accessing and serving mean that sharing happens in surprising ways. Survival by sharing. Because it's a bad, leaky archive, QAW is never static. It holds space and objects and people and relations, but does not contain them. Our library is totally unorganized. We've got more than 1,000 items that are yet to be cataloged. There's no way to search and no way to track. We don't even have keywords. Because nothing is fixed, new relationships are constantly forming in this non-linear bad archive. I don't know how long we can keep it like that. It's a bad archive because its demise is always possible, always threatened by obscurity. What if it stops being useful? Online, we offer a small but significant collection of digitized zines available for download, taken from other archives, some legit, some bad. Together, these different sharing approaches try to make space and make visible evidence of who we are and where we've been, protected for now, as safe as can be. Not everyone has survived. 6 million people are dead from COVID worldwide. What are we doing? What are we learning in this extended moment? We do what we can, sharing skills, using publishing as an empowering force, making zines and collaborative docs to self-organize and educate. We collect, protect, and give access. We build bad archives with messy, queer, non-cooperative logics. We discover new ways to make and change network culture. These impulses travel through time and connect to larger trajectories, speaking with ancestors, always emerging below and within crisis. We survive by sharing, communicate in community, the garage door to the bad archive left open by us to us. The illegitimate bad archive persists. That's it.